The drive back to Cedar Ridge took 4 hours, but it felt like rewinding through decades I'd spent trying to forget. Every mile marker was a memory I'd buried, every familiar curve in the highway a reminder of why I'd left this place behind. The rental car felt too clean, too modern for these roads that still looked like they belonged in 1995. Nothing here had changed, which somehow made everything feel wrong. I hadn't been back in 11 years. Not since graduation night, when I'd thrown my cap in the air and sworn I'd never return. Cities were for dreamers, I told myself. Rural towns were for people who'd given up. I'd been so sure I was different, so certain I belonged somewhere else. Now here I was, pulling into the gravel parking lot of Riverside Chapel at 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 days after getting the phone call that changed everything. Your father passed Monday morning, the voice had said. Heart attack. Funerals Thursday. No preamble, no warmth. Just facts delivered like weather reports. The chapel looked smaller than I remembered. Everything did. The white clapboard siding needed paint, and the steeple tilted slightly to the left, like it was tired of holding itself straight. Cars filled the small lot, pickup trucks mostly, a few sedans that had seen better years. I recognized some of them, though I couldn't place the owners anymore. Time had a way of blurring faces while keeping vehicles sharp in memory. I sat in the car for 5 minutes, watching people file inside. Men in uncomfortable-looking suits, women clutching purses and tissues. Some nodded to each other in that practiced way of small-town familiarity. Others walked alone, heads down, carrying grief like grocery bags they couldn't quite manage. I should have felt something. Sadness, maybe, regret. Instead, there was just this hollow aching, like hunger but deeper. My father was dead, and I felt like I was attending a stranger's funeral. The service started without fanfare. Pastor Williams, older now, grayer, but still the same man who'd baptized me in the river when I was 8, spoke about eternal rest and God's plan. I sat in the back row, close to the door, ready to leave the moment it ended. The chapel smelled like old wood and flowers that were trying too hard to mask the weight of sorrow. That's when I saw him. He was sitting 3 rows ahead, on the right side, perfectly still while everyone else shifted and fidgeted. Dark hair, broad shoulders filling out a simple black suit. There was something about the way he held himself, present, grounded, like he belonged here more than I ever had. While others wiped their eyes or stared at their hands, he watched Pastor Williams with complete attention, as if every word mattered. I found myself studying him instead of listening to the eulogy. The curve of his neck, the way his hands rested calmly on his knees. When Mrs. Henderson started sobbing in the front row, everyone turned to look except him. He just bowed his head slightly respectfully, like he understood grief was meant to be private even when it happened in public. Who was he? I'd grown up here, knew every face, every family, but this man was unfamiliar, which should have been impossible in a town of Talon 200 people, unless he'd moved here after I left. The thought shouldn't have bothered me, but it did. 11 years was long enough for strangers to become neighbors, for life to continue without witnesses. Pastor Williams was talking about my father now, about his work at the hardware store, his quiet faith, his love for fishing on Sunday mornings. I wanted to laugh, but not with humor. Love for fishing. The man I remembered spent Sundays drinking beer on the couch, yelling at football games on a television with rabbit ears. Maybe grief had a way of editing memories, making saints out of ordinary men. Frank was a man who believed in fixing things rather than throwing them away, Pastor Williams continued. He could repair anything with enough time and patience. Those who worked alongside him know this better than most. The stranger's shoulders tensed slightly, just a small movement barely noticeable, but I caught it, as if those words meant something specific to him, as if he'd been one of those people who'd worked alongside my father. The realization hit me with unexpected force. This man had known my father. Recently, well enough to sit through his funeral with the kind of stillness that comes from real grief, not obligation. I'd driven 4 hours to bury a man I'd barely spoken to in over a decade, while somewhere strangers had been part of his daily life. Had coffee with him, maybe, shared stories I'd never hear, knew the person he'd become after I'd decided he wasn't worth knowing. The service ended with Amazing Grace, sung by a choir that was mostly women over 60. I stood with everyone else mouthing words I remembered from childhood while watching the stranger in the black suit. He knew all the verses. His voice was low, warm, blending with the others like he'd done this before, like he belonged. As people filed out, offering condolences and promising to see each other at the house, I lingered. The stranger moved toward the front where my father's casket sat covered in carnations and baby's breath. He stood there for a long moment, his head bowed, lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been goodbye. I wanted to approach him, to ask who he was, how he'd known my father, what stories he might tell that could fill the holes in my understanding. But something held me back. Maybe fear, maybe the sense that his grief was more legitimate than mine, and I had no right to intrude. Instead, I watched him leave. He walked like he carried weight, but had learned how to bear it gracefully. At the door, he turned back once, scanning the chapel. His eyes found mine across the empty pews, and for a heartbeat we looked at each other. Brown eyes, serious but not unkind. There was something in his expression I couldn't name. Recognition maybe, though we'd never met, or maybe just the shared understanding of people who'd lost something they couldn't get back. Then he was gone, and I was alone with the flowers and the silence. The house looked exactly the same. White aluminum siding, green shutters that had needed replacing since I was in high school, a front porch that sagged slightly on the left side. Dad's truck was still in the driveway, a 1998 Ford F-150 with more rust than paint. Someone had washed it recently. The thought of my father taking care of his truck in his final days, or maybe someone else doing it for him, made something twist in my chest. People were already gathering inside. The front door stood open and voices drifted out along with the smell of coffee and casseroles that appeared at every funeral in small towns. Mrs. Patterson from next door was arranging food on the dining room table. Mr. Rodriguez, who taught me algebra, sat on the couch looking older and smaller than I remembered. Everyone moved carefully around each other, the way people do when they're not sure if they're supposed to be sad or relieved. I found myself standing in the living room surrounded by a life I'd walked away from. The same brown recliner where my father had spent most evenings, the same wood-paneled walls, covered in photographs I'd stopped looking at years ago. Everything was neat, organized in a way I didn't remember from childhood. Someone had been taking care of things. "You must be David." I turned. The stranger from the funeral stood in the doorway holding a coffee cup in both hands like he was trying to warm himself. Up close, I could see he was probably in his early 30s with the kind of tan that came from working outside and lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than he frowned. But he wasn't smiling now. I am. I waited for him to introduce himself, to explain who he was and why he was in my father's house, drinking coffee like he belonged here. I'm Caleb. He stepped closer, extending his hand. His grip was firm, calloused. I'm sorry for your loss. The words were standard funeral speak, but something in his tone made them feel genuine, like he actually was sorry, not just going through motions. Thank you. I released his hand, still waiting for explanation. I don't think we've met. No, we haven't. He took a sip of coffee, studying me over the rim of his cup. I helped your father out sometimes. Repairs, yard work, that kind of thing. Helped him out. The phrase was careful, neutral. It could mean anything from occasional favors to regular employment. I found myself curious about which it was, about how much time this stranger had spent in my childhood home while I was building a life 200 miles away. That was kind of you. Not really. Caleb's mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile. Frank was easy to work for. Never asked for more than you could give, always paid fair, and he made good coffee. Frank, not your father or Mr. Morrison. Frank, like they'd been friends. The casual familiarity in his voice made my chest tighten with something I couldn't name. Envy maybe, or regret. He talked about you a lot, Caleb continued, his voice quieter now. About how proud he was that you'd made something of yourself in the city. The words hit me like cold water. That surprises me. It shouldn't. Caleb's brown eyes were steady on mine. He kept newspaper clippings. Anytime your company got mentioned, any awards you won, he'd show them to anyone who'd look. I stared at him. My father had been following my career, collecting evidence of my success like some kind of proud parent. It didn't fit with the man I remembered, the one who'd called my job pushing papers for people with too much money. But then, maybe people changed in 11 years. Maybe I'd never given him the chance to show me who he'd become. I didn't know that, I said finally. There's probably a lot you didn't know. There was no judgment in Caleb's voice, just observation. He wasn't much for long-distance phone calls, said he never knew what to say that wouldn't sound like he was trying to pull you back here. The conversation was moving into territory I wasn't prepared for. I'd come back for a funeral, not for revelations about the father I'd spent years trying not to think about. But something about Caleb made me want to keep talking, to understand what I'd missed. How long did you know him? About 5 years. Caleb finished his coffee, held the empty cup between his palms. I moved here after my divorce, looking for somewhere quiet to figure things out. Frank hired me to help re-shingle his roof. One job turned into another, then another. Eventually, I was coming by most weekends. The words painted a picture I couldn't reconcile with my memories. My father, who'd barely spoken to neighbors when I was growing up, developing a friendship with someone young enough to be his son, having regular company, regular help, living a life I knew nothing about. What was he like? The question came out before I could stop it. I mean, recently, these last few years. Caleb considered this, his head tilted slightly. Lonely, I think, but not bitter about it. He'd made his choices, accepted the consequences. He liked routine. Coffee at 6, breakfast at 6:30, morning news until 7. Then he'd putter around the house or the yard until it got too hot. Afternoons, he'd sit on the back porch and read. Westerns, mostly Louis L'Amour. I almost smiled. Dad had always loved westerns. As a kid, I'd rolled my eyes at the stack of paperbacks on his nightstand, all featuring cowboys and horses and wide open spaces. Now the image of him reading alone on the back porch made something ache in my throat. He stopped drinking, Caleb added quietly. About 2 years ago, said it wasn't doing him any favors. That did surprise me. My father's relationship with beer had been complicated but constant throughout my childhood. Weekend mornings, he'd nurse hangovers with black coffee and silence. Weekend evenings, he'd work his way through a six-pack while watching whatever sports were on television. The idea of him choosing sobriety, especially without external pressure, felt like learning about a different person entirely. Good for him, I said, and meant it. I think you leaving helped, actually. Caleb's words were careful, like he was testing whether I could handle them. Not because he blamed you or anything, but because it made him look at what kind of man he was, what kind of father he'd been. He wanted to be better, even if you weren't around to see it. The conversation was getting too heavy, too real. I wasn't ready for forgiveness or understanding or whatever this was supposed to be. I'd built my life on the certainty that leaving had been the right choice, that my father was exactly the man I remembered him to be. Learning he'd changed, that he'd missed me, that he tried to become someone worthy of missing, it complicated everything. I should check on the food, I said, looking for an escape, but Caleb just nodded. Mind if I help? The kitchen was full of women I half remembered, arranging casseroles and slicing pies with the efficiency of people who'd done this too many times before. Mrs. Henderson was there, red-eyed but functioning. Sarah Phillips, who'd been 2 grades ahead of me in school, now looking like she had teenagers of her own. They nodded at me with the mixture of sympathy and curiosity reserved for prodigal sons at family funerals. Caleb moved among them like he belonged, refilling coffee cups and carrying empty dishes to the sink. They knew him, clearly, treated him like family rather than hired help. When Mrs. Henderson patted his arm and whispered something that made him nod seriously, I realized he'd probably been here before, for other gatherings, other occasions. While I'd been absent, he'd become part of the community I'd abandoned. David, honey, you must be hungry. Mrs. Patterson appeared at my elbow with a plate piled high with food I didn't recognize. This is your favorite, isn't it? Green bean casserole. I couldn't remember ever having a favorite casserole, but I took the plate and thanked her. The food was good, the kind of comfort cooking that small towns specialized in. I ate standing up, watching people move through my father's house like they belonged here more than I did. Gets overwhelming, doesn't it? I looked up. Caleb had appeared beside me holding his own plate. A little. You want some air? The back porch is usually quieter. I followed him through the kitchen, past the women who were already starting to clean up. The back door led to a small covered porch that looked out over the yard I'd played in as a child. Someone had been maintaining it. The grass was cut, the flower beds weeded, the old oak tree trimmed back from the house. You did all this? I asked. Frank helped. He liked having projects. Caleb set his plate on the porch railing, pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket. You mind? I shook my head. I'd quit smoking 3 years ago, but something about the day made me want to make an exception. Caleb seemed to understand because he offered me one without asking. The first drag hit harder than I expected. I coughed, which made Caleb smile slightly. Out of practice? Something like that. We smoked in comfortable silence, looking out at the yard. The sun was starting to set, painting everything golden. In the distance, I could hear the sound of the river that had given the town its name. It was peaceful in a way I'd forgotten rural places could be. It's different than you remember, Caleb said. It wasn't a question. Everything's smaller, quieter. I took another drag, gentler this time. When I was a kid, this place felt huge, like the whole world was contained in these few square miles. Maybe it was then, maybe. I looked at him. What made you stay after your divorce? I mean, you could have gone anywhere. Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. I tried anywhere. Spent 2 years bouncing around, looking for something that felt like home. Turns out, home isn't a place you find, it's a place you make. And sometimes, if you're lucky, other people help you make it. Like my father. Like your father. He stubbed out his cigarette, turned to face me fully. He wasn't perfect, David. I'm not trying to paint him as some kind of saint. He had regrets, made mistakes, but he was a good man who tried to do right by people, and he loved you, even if he didn't know how to show it. The words hung between us in the cooling air. Inside, I could hear the sounds of the gathering winding down. Dishes being stacked, goodbyes being exchanged, cars starting in the driveway. Soon everyone would be gone, and I'd be alone in my father's house with nothing but memories I wasn't sure I wanted to claim. There was something about him, I said, surprising myself by speaking the thought aloud, like he'd stayed behind to remember what the rest of us had tried to forget. Caleb nodded slowly. He was good at that, holding on to things, sometimes too good. As if summoned by his words, a light rain began to fall. Just a gentle pattering on the porch roof, but enough to drive us closer to the house. Caleb moved nearer, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with cigarette smoke and something else. Sawdust, maybe, or wood polish. Look at that, he said softly, pointing to the corner of the porch where an old photograph hung in a simple frame. It was crooked, tilted by wind or time, and water-stained around the edges. The picture showed a much younger version of my father standing beside a car I remembered from childhood, a blue Ford Galaxy with chrome bumpers and fins. He was smiling, his arm around a woman I recognized as my mother, though she'd been gone for 15 years now. Between them stood a boy of maybe 10, gangly and serious, holding a fishing pole like it was a sword. Me. I remembered that day, or thought I did. A fishing trip to Miller's Pond. Back when we still did things together as a family. Before Mom got sick. Before everything changed. He couldn't throw anything away, Caleb said quietly, studying the photograph with something that might have been affection. The observation hit me harder than it should have. My father, the pack rat who'd kept every broken tool and worn-out shirt, who'd apparently collected newspaper clippings about a son who never called, who'd held onto a water-damaged photograph of a time when we'd been happy hanging it where he could see it every time he sat on his porch. Neither could I thought, but didn't say. In my apartment back in Chicago, I had a shoebox full of things I should have thrown away years ago. Movie ticket stubs from dates that had led nowhere, birthday cards from friends who'd moved on, a coffee mug from my first job that was chipped and useless but somehow impossible to discard. Maybe that was something we'd shared, my father and I, the inability to let go of things that mattered, even when they hurt to keep. You okay? Caleb's voice was gentle, concerned. I realized I'd been staring at the photograph for a long time, lost in memories that felt more real than the present moment. Yeah, it's been a long day. It has. The rain was picking up now, drumming harder on the roof. Through the kitchen window, I could see the last of the guests gathering their things, preparing to face the weather. Soon it would just be me and this house full of things my father couldn't throw away. I didn't want to talk about my father. I didn't want to talk about grief or regret or all the years we'd lost, but I wanted Caleb to stay. The realization surprised me with its intensity. This need for the company of someone who was essentially a stranger, who'd known my father better than I had, who looked at me like he could see through whatever mask I was wearing. I should go help clean up, I said, but I didn't move. Mrs. Henderson's got it handled. She's been organizing church events for 30 years. A funeral reception is nothing she can't manage. Still. But Caleb didn't move either. We stood there in the growing darkness, listening to the rain and the distant sounds of people saying goodbye. There was something comfortable about the silence between us, like we'd been having conversations for years instead of hours. This is strange, I said finally. What is? You being here, knowing things about my father that I don't know. It feels like I'm visiting someone else's life instead of coming home. Maybe you are. Caleb leaned against the porch railing, his face serious in the dim light. The life you left behind ended when you left. Your father built a new one without you. That doesn't mean either of you was wrong. Just means time kept moving. The words were matter of fact but not unkind. Still, they stung because they were true. I'd expected to come back and find everything exactly as I'd left it, frozen in time like a museum exhibit. Instead, I discovered that life had continued, that my father had found friendship and purpose and maybe even happiness without me. It should have made me feel better, knowing he hadn't spent 11 years pining for a son who never called. Instead, it made me feel more lost than ever. By 8 o'clock, the house was quiet. The last guest had driven away through the rain, leaving behind empty casserole dishes and promises to check on me before I left town. Mrs. Henderson had tried to convince me to let her stay and help with the dishes, but I'd insisted I could manage. What I didn't say was that I needed to be alone with my father's things to try to understand who he'd been in the years since I'd known him. Except I wasn't alone. Caleb had remained after everyone else left, moving quietly through the house, stacking plates and wiping down surfaces without being asked. When I'd suggested he didn't need to stay, he just shrugged and said it felt wrong to leave all the work to me. Now we stood in the kitchen together, surrounded by the detritus of a well-attended funeral. Dishes filled the sink, leftover food covered the counters, and folding chairs, borrowed from the church, waited to be returned. It was the kind of mess that would take hours to clean properly, but somehow it didn't feel overwhelming with two people sharing the work. You don't have to do this, I said, watching Caleb stack plates with practiced efficiency. I know. I mean it. You've done enough already. More than enough. He looked at me, then really looked, like he was trying to read something in my expression. Do you want me to go? The question hung in the air between us. The honest answer was no. I didn't want him to go. I wanted him to stay and tell me more stories about my father. I wanted him to help me understand how a man I'd barely spoken to in 11 years had managed to earn the kind of friendship that brought someone to his funeral and kept them after to wash dishes. I wanted to figure out why this stranger felt more familiar than my own hometown, why his presence made the weight of the day feel manageable instead of crushing, but wanting someone to stay was different from having the right to ask them to. It's not about what I want, I said finally. You've got your own life to get back to. Not really. Caleb set down the plates he'd been holding, turned to face me fully. I work for myself, set my own schedule, and I don't have anywhere I need to be tonight. But, David, his voice was quiet but firm, you don't have to go through all this alone. The words hit me like a physical thing, something solid and warm settling in my chest. When was the last time someone had offered to stay with me through something difficult? Not out of obligation or a social convention, but because they thought I might need the company? I don't even know what I'm going through, I admitted. Caleb was quiet for a long moment considering this. Then he moved to the sink, began running water over the accumulated dishes. Then we'll figure it out as we go, he said simply. I watched him work, this man who'd appeared in my life 12 hours ago and was now washing my father's dishes like it was the most natural thing in the world. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong forearms marked with small scars that spoke of years working with his hands. There was something both graceful and practical in the way he moved, like someone who'd learned to find satisfaction in small necessary tasks. I'll stay, he said softly, not looking at me. If you want. The offer hung between us, simple and complicated all at once. He wasn't talking about just helping with dishes, he was talking about staying through whatever came next. The long evening ahead, the harder conversations, the process of sifting through a life I'd never fully understood. I could say no, should say no, probably. He was a stranger, essentially, someone who'd known my father but didn't know me. It would be easier to handle this alone, to maintain the careful distance I'd built between myself and anything that felt too much like home. But as I stood there listening to the rain and watching him work in the kitchen where my father had made his morning coffee for 40 years, I realized I didn't want easy anymore. I wanted to understand. I wanted to remember. I wanted someone to stay who didn't have to, who'd chosen to be here because he thought I might need him. And God help me, I did need him. I'd never needed someone more. Okay, I said. He looked up from the dishes, meeting my eyes across the small kitchen. In the overhead light, his face was serious but warm, like he understood the weight of what we were agreeing to. Okay. And in that moment, as the rain continued to fall and the house settled around us with the weight of accumulated memory, something shifted. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it, fragile and unexpected and somehow inevitable, the beginning of something neither of us had been looking for, but both of us needed more than we'd known how to say. To be continued, part 2. The dishes were done, the leftover food wrapped and stored, the borrowed chairs stacked by the front door for tomorrow's return to the church. We'd worked in comfortable silence for the better part of an hour, finding a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Caleb washed, I dried, and somehow the kitchen began to feel less like a crime scene of grief and more like a room where people lived. Now we stood in the living room, surrounded by my father's things and the weight of everything unsaid. The old house creaked around us, settling into night with sounds I'd forgotten I knew. Outside, wind was picking up, rattling the windows and sending tree branches scratching against the siding. A storm was building. I could feel it in the air, that electric tension that made everything feel poised on the edge of something significant. You want some coffee? I asked, though what I really wanted was something stronger. Caleb shook his head, then paused. Actually, do you know if your father kept any liquor around? The question surprised me. Dad had given up drinking, according to Caleb, but that didn't mean he'd gotten rid of everything. I thought about the kitchen cabinets I hadn't opened, the closets I hadn't searched. There might be something. I found it in the pantry behind a row of canned vegetables that looked like they'd been there since the Clinton administration. A bottle of Jameson still sealed, the kind of whiskey my father used to save for special occasions that rarely came. The label was slightly dusty, but the bottle was full. Apparently, even in sobriety, he'd held on to this one piece of his former life. This work? I held up the bottle. Caleb nodded. That'll work fine. I found 2 glasses in the china cabinet, actual crystal, not the everyday tumblers from the kitchen. My mother's good glasses, the ones that came out for holidays and important guests. It felt appropriate somehow using them now, like honoring both of my parents in a single gesture. We settled into the living room, me in my father's old recliner, Caleb on the couch. I poured 2 fingers of whiskey into each glass, handed one to Caleb, kept the other for myself. The first sip burned in the best way, warming me from the inside out. To Frank, Caleb said quietly, raising his glass. To Frank, I agreed, though the words felt strange in my mouth. We drank to my father, this man we'd both known in such different ways, and I wondered if grief always felt this complicated. Outside, the storm was intensifying. Rain began pattering against the windows, soft at first but growing steadier. Lightning flickered in the distance, still miles away but moving closer. The old house seemed to lean into the weather, embracing the drama of it. Tell me about leaving, Caleb said after a long silence. Leaving here? Leaving anywhere? What it feels like to walk away from everything you've known. I took another sip of whiskey, considered the question. Like jumping off a cliff and hoping you'll figure out how to fly before you hit the ground. Caleb smiled at that. Did you figure out how to fly? Eventually, took a while. I looked around the room at the photographs on the mantel and the books on the shelves that I'd never seen my father read. But now, I'm back here and I feel like I'm falling again, except this time I'm not sure there's anywhere to land. Maybe that's not the point. What do you mean? Caleb was quiet for a moment, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Maybe the point isn't to land somewhere safe. Maybe it's just to keep falling until you figure out how to enjoy the view. The words hit me in a way I wasn't expecting. I'd spent so many years trying to build something solid, something permanent. A career, an apartment, a life that looked successful from the outside. But sitting here in my father's house, drinking his whiskey with a man I'd known for less than a day, I couldn't remember the last time I'd enjoyed anything. I'd been so focused on landing safely that I'd forgotten to look around. Is that what you did when you came here? Not at first. Caleb's voice was thoughtful. At first, I was just trying to hide from my ex-wife, from the life we'd built together, from the person I'd been when I was with her. I thought if I could get far enough away, I could somehow become someone different. Did it work? In a way. He took a slow sip of whiskey, but not the way I expected. I didn't become someone different. I just became more myself. Turns out the person I'd been trying to be for all those years wasn't really me at all. Thunder rumbled in the distance, closer now. The storm was moving fast the way they did in this part of the country. In another hour, it would be directly overhead. What were you trying to be? I asked. Successful, driven, the kind of man who wore suits and had important meetings and never got his hands dirty. Caleb looked down at his palms, scarred and calloused from years of manual labor. My ex-wife wanted that version of me. Hell, I thought I wanted to be that version of me, but it never fit right. And now I fix things for a living. I get up when the sun rises and go to bed when I'm tired. I have conversations with people like your father who don't care what kind of car I drive or how much money I make. He met my eyes. It's smaller than the life I had before, but it's real. The honesty in his voice was startling. In Chicago, I surrounded myself with people who spoke in professional euphemisms and careful networking language. Authentic emotion was something you kept private, something that might make you vulnerable in a world that rewarded strength above all else. But here was Caleb offering his truth like it was the most natural thing in the world. Do you miss it, the other life? Sometimes. He was quiet for a long moment. I miss feeling important. I miss the rush of closing a big deal, of knowing that other people thought I was successful. But I don't miss feeling like a stranger in my own skin. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room for a brief moment. In that instant of brightness, I saw something in Caleb's expression that I recognized. The look of someone who'd built a life that looked right from the outside but felt wrong from within. I think I know what you mean, I said. Yeah, my job, my apartment, the whole life I've built. It all looks exactly like what I thought I wanted when I was 18, but lately, I paused, surprised by my own honesty. Lately, it feels like I'm playing a part in someone else's story. What would your story look like? The question hung between us, heavy with possibility. I'd spent so many years focused on achievement, on building something that would prove I'd made the right choice in leaving, that I'd never really considered what I actually wanted my life to feel like. I don't know, I admitted. That's the problem. Caleb nodded like he understood. Outside, the rain was coming down harder now, drumming on the roof with increasing intensity. The storm was almost here. Mind if I look around a little? Caleb asked. I spent a lot of time in this house, but mostly in the kitchen and the back rooms. I'm curious about the rest of it. Go ahead, make yourself at home, He stood, wandering over to the bookshelves that lined one wall. My father had been a reader, though I'd never paid much attention to his taste. Now I watched Caleb examine the spines. Mysteries mostly, some westerns, a few volumes of history. On the lower shelves were photo albums, their covers faded and dusty. "May I?" Caleb asked, gesturing to one of the albums. I nodded, curious myself. I hadn't looked through family photos in years. He pulled out a thick album bound in fake leather, the kind that was popular in the 80s. We settled back onto the couch, sitting closer together so we could both see the pages. The whiskey was starting to work its magic, making everything feel softer around the edges. The first pages were baby pictures, me, obviously, though I looked like every other bald, red-faced infant in the history of photography. My mother looked impossibly young, barely out of her teens, holding me with the careful attention of someone who wasn't entirely sure what she was doing. My father appeared in a few shots, but always in the background, like he wasn't quite sure if he belonged in the frame. "Your parents were kids themselves," Caleb observed. 20 and 22 when I was born. I studied a picture of them standing beside the blue Ford Galaxy I'd seen in the photograph on the porch. They looked happy but uncertain, like people playing house before they'd figured out the rules. We turned pages slowly, watching me grow from baby to toddler to small child, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, random moments that had seemed important enough to document. My mother was in most of them, usually smiling. My father appeared less frequently, and when he did, he looked uncomfortable with the camera's attention. "He wasn't much for pictures," I said. "Some people aren't." Caleb turned another page, revealing photos from what looked like a family camping trip. "But he kept all of these. That says something." The camping photos showed a different side of my father. He looked relaxed, genuinely happy as he helped a younger me set up a tent or cook hot dogs over a fire. In one picture, he was teaching me to cast a fishing line, his hands covering mine on the rod. I had no memory of that trip, but the evidence was there in faded color. We kept turning pages, moving through my elementary school years, soccer games, school plays, random moments of childhood that felt like someone else's life. Then, near the middle of the album, Caleb stopped. "Jesus," he said softly. The photograph showed a group of kids at what looked like a summer festival or fair. I was there, maybe 10 years old, standing with several other children in front of a carnival game. But what had caught Caleb's attention was another boy in the picture, slightly older, with dark hair and a bandage across his forehead. "That was me," he said quietly. I stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the injured child with the man sitting beside me. But the more I looked, the more certain I became. The eyes were the same, serious even as a child. The way he held himself, slightly apart from the group, was familiar. "You're sure?" "Positive." Caleb pointed to the bandage on the boy's forehead. "I got that falling off the Ferris wheel that year. 12 stitches. My mom was furious that I'd climbed up the outside of the cage instead of staying seated like a normal person." The realization hit me like cold water. Caleb and I had been in the same place at the same time 30 years ago. We'd probably stood within feet of each other, maybe even spoken, but neither of us remembered the encounter. It was the kind of near miss that happened all the time in small towns, lives intersecting briefly before splitting apart again. "Do you remember me being there?" I asked. "No." He studied the photograph more carefully. But I remember that day, the festival, the accident, the way my mother fussed over the stitches. I just don't remember you specifically. I don't remember you either. I looked at the photo again, at these two children who'd shared space and time, without knowing they'd meet again, decades later, in a house full of grief and possibility. It's strange, isn't it, how close we came to knowing each other back then. Maybe we weren't ready then. The observation was simple but profound. At 10 and 12, we'd been different people shaped by different circumstances. The boy I'd been then was still forming, still figuring out who he might become. And Caleb had been just a kid who took risks on Ferris wheels, not yet the man who'd learned to find peace in quiet places and honest work. Maybe not, I agreed. We kept looking through the album, but the atmosphere had shifted somehow. The discovery of that old photograph had added weight to the evening, a sense that what was happening between us was more than chance. We were children of the same place, shaped by the same landscape, connected by invisible threads we were only now beginning to see. The photos moved into my teenage years, and I found myself cringing at the evidence of my younger self. Bad haircuts, worse fashion choices, the particular kind of awkwardness that seemed to define adolescence. But there was something else in those later pictures, a restlessness, a sense of looking beyond the frame towards something else. "You can see it starting," Caleb said, as if reading my thoughts. "What?" "The need to leave. It's in your eyes, even in the family pictures, like you're already somewhere else in your head." He was right. In every photo from my junior and senior year of high school, I looked like I was tolerating the moment rather than living it, waiting for real life to begin somewhere else. Was I that obvious? To someone who's felt the same thing? Yeah. Thunder crashed overhead, much closer now. The storm had arrived in earnest, bringing with it the kind of downpour that turned streets into rivers and made the world feel small and contained. Lightning flashed almost continuously, turning the living room into a series of stark black and white snapshots. "I should check the windows," I said, starting to get up. "They'll be fine." Caleb's voice was calm, unworried. "This house has weathered worse storms than this." But I was already moving, suddenly restless. The whiskey, the photographs, the weight of the day, it was all catching up with me at once. I needed to do something, to feel useful, to avoid sitting still with thoughts that were becoming harder to manage. I wandered into my father's bedroom, a space I'd avoided since arriving. It looked exactly like I'd expected, simple, neat, almost monastic. The bed was made with military precision. A single book lay on the nightstand beside a pair of reading glasses I'd never seen him wear. The dresser was clear except for a small wooden box that probably held cufflinks and spare change. Without really thinking about it, I pulled open the top drawer of the dresser. Inside were the usual things: socks, underwear, a few t-shirts folded with the same precision as the bed. But underneath the clothes, my fingers found something unexpected: a small stack of letters tied together with a rubber band. My address was on the envelopes, written in my father's careful handwriting. But there was no postmark, no evidence they'd ever been mailed. I pulled them out, stared at them with growing comprehension. Letters addressed to me, written but never sent. How many were there? 10, 15 years worth of thoughts and words he'd never found the courage to share. The realization hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been building my life in Chicago because I'm convinced my father had written me off entirely, he'd been writing to me regularly, putting his thoughts on paper even if he couldn't bring himself to put them in the mail. My hands were shaking as I pulled the rubber band free, unfolded the first letter. The date was from 3 years ago. David, it began. I saw in the paper that your company won some kind of award. I cut out the article, though I'm not sure why. I guess I wanted to have proof that you're doing well, that leaving here was the right choice for you. I couldn't read anymore. The words blurred as my eyes filled with tears I hadn't seen coming. 3 years ago, when I'd gotten that award, I'd stood in a room full of colleagues and clients, accepting congratulations and feeling nothing but hollow satisfaction. Meanwhile, 200 miles away, my father had been cutting the announcement out of a newspaper, proud enough to save it, but too afraid or too proud to reach out. David? Caleb's voice came from the doorway, careful and concerned. I tried to answer, but no words came. The letter slipped from my fingers, scattering across the floor like fallen leaves. 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. Dates reaching back almost to the beginning of my time in Chicago. A decade of unsent letters, of love expressed in private and never shared. The sob that came out of me was raw, ugly, the sound of something breaking that had been held together by force of will. I sank down onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I'd found and what it meant. Caleb moved into the room without hesitation, kneeling to gather the scattered letters. He didn't read them. I noticed that, even in my distress, just collected them carefully and set them on the nightstand. Then he sat beside me on the bed, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body, but not so close as to crowd me. He didn't say anything, didn't try to fix what was broken or explain what it meant. He just stayed solid and purpled and present while I fell apart. I never called him, I managed between sobs. Not once in 11 years, and he was writing letters. I know. He was proud of me. He was keeping track, and I know. Caleb's hand found mine, covered it with gentle pressure, not trying to pull me toward comfort, just anchoring me to the present moment while I processed the weight of what I'd discovered. We sat like that for a long time, listening to the storm rage outside and the quieter storm of my grief inside. Eventually, the sobs subsided, leaving me empty and exhausted, but somehow cleaner, like lancing a wound that had been festering for years. He didn't know how to reach you, Caleb said quietly when I'd gotten my breathing under control. He talked about it sometimes, wondered if you were happy, if you ever thought about home, if you'd want to hear from him. But he was afraid that calling would seem like he was trying to pull you back, and he knew you needed to build your own life. So he wrote letters instead. I looked at the stack on the nightstand, imagining my father sitting at his kitchen table in the evenings, trying to find words for things he'd never learned how to say out loud. The image was heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time. I don't know if I can read them, I said. You don't have to, not now anyway, maybe not ever if you don't want to. But I should want to, shouldn't I? They're the last thing he left for me. Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering his words. Want and should are different things. Right now you're grieving a father you thought you'd lost years ago and discovering you never really lost him at all. That's a lot to carry, Give yourself time to figure out what you can handle. The wisdom in his words surprised me. This man I'd known for a day seemed to understand the complexities of grief better than I did, even though it was my grief to carry. How do you know so much about this? I asked. Experience. His thumb moved across my knuckles, a small gesture of comfort. I lost my dad when I was 25. Car accident. We'd been fighting about my engagement, about whether my fiancée was right for me. The last thing I said to him was that he didn't know what he's talking about. Jesus. The funeral was the worst day of my life, not just because he was gone, but because I realized he'd been right about everything and I'd never get to tell him. Caleb's voice was steady, but I could hear the old pain underneath. It took me years to figure out that grief isn't about the conversations you didn't have. It's about carrying forward the love that was always there, even when you couldn't see it. Is that what you think this is? Love that was always there? I think your father wrote those letters because he loved you and didn't know how to show it while you were both still stubborn enough to stay silent. Caleb squeezed my hand gently. And I think you came back for his funeral because somewhere deep down you loved him too, even after all the years and all the silence. The truth of that statement settled into my chest like a stone. I had loved my father, despite everything. That's why leaving had hurt so much, why staying away had required such effort. You don't spend 11 years avoiding someone who doesn't matter to you. I'm tired, I said, and meant it in every possible way. Let's go sit in the kitchen. I'll make some tea. By the time we made it to the kitchen, the storm was directly overhead. Lightning and thunder came almost simultaneously, shaking the old house and making the lights flicker. But instead of feeling frightening, the weather felt appropriate somehow, like the sky was mourning alongside me. Caleb moved around the kitchen with the familiarity of someone who'd been here many times before. He found tea bags in the pantry, filled the kettle, set it on the stove to boil. I sat at the kitchen table and watched him work, grateful not to have to make decisions or take care of details. Chamomile okay? He asked. Perfect. The tea was exactly what I needed. Warm, soothing, something to hold while we sat in companionable quiet. The kitchen felt different at night, more intimate somehow. The overhead light cast everything in warm yellow tones, making the space feel smaller and safer than it had during the day. Can I ask you something? I said after a while. Sure. Why are you really here? I mean, helping with the funeral, staying tonight. It's more than friendship with my father would require. Caleb considered the question, turning his mug slowly in his hands. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. That's not really an answer. No, it's not. He looked up, met my eyes across the table. When Frank died, I felt lost, I guess. He'd become important to me in a way I didn't fully understand until he was gone. Not like a father. My relationship with my own dad was too complicated for that, but like an anchor point maybe, someone who reminded me that it was possible to live a quiet, decent life. And then I showed up. And then you showed up. His smile was soft, barely there. This person he talked about constantly but never contacted. His son who'd built successful life in the city but looked lost standing in a small town chapel. Gee, thanks. I'm not saying it to be cruel. Caleb's voice was gentle. I'm saying it because I recognize something in you. The same thing I saw in the mirror after my divorce. Someone who'd gotten everything they thought they wanted and couldn't figure out why it didn't feel like enough. The observation hit closer to home than I cared to admit. And you think staying here tonight is going to fix that? I don't think anything can fix that except time and honest conversation with yourself. He took a sip of tea, gathered his thoughts. But I think maybe we both need the company tonight. Me because I'm still figuring out how to grieve someone who mattered more than I expected, and you because you're trying to reconcile the father you remember with the man he became. So we're using each other. We're helping each other. The distinction was subtle but important. There's a difference. Outside, the storm was beginning to move past us. The thunder was more distant now, the lightning less frequent, but the rain continued, steady and soothing against the windows. Tell me about the letters, Caleb said quietly. What did the one you read say? I thought about the few lines I'd managed to get through before breaking down. That he'd seen an article about my company winning an award, that he'd cut it out and kept it, that he was proud but didn't want to interfere with my life. Sounds like Frank. You think there are more like that, years worth of I'm proud but won't bother you letters? Probably. Caleb's honesty was both brutal and kind. He showed me those newspaper clippings, David, every promotion, every company milestone, every time your name appeared in print. He had them organized in a folder, chronological order. He knew more about your career than some of your colleagues probably do. The image of my father carefully cutting out articles and filing them away was almost too much to bear. All those years I'd convinced myself he didn't care about my success, that leaving home meant leaving behind any chance of his approval. Meanwhile, he'd been documenting my achievements like a proud parent who just didn't know how to express it directly. I wish I'd known. Would it have changed anything? The question caught me off guard. I don't know. Maybe is honest. Caleb reached across the table, covered my hand with his. You were building a life, David. That required focus, determination, the ability to move forward without looking back too often. Maybe knowing about the letters would have helped, but maybe it would have made things harder. You're very generous with your interpretation of my choices, I'm realistic about them. He didn't move his hand away, and I found myself grateful for the contact. People do what they need to do to survive. You needed to leave to prove you could make it somewhere else. Your father needed to let you go, even though it meant living with the silence. Neither of you was wrong. You were just incompatible in your methods of caring about each other. Incompatible in your methods of caring. The phrase struck me as perfectly accurate and heartbreakingly sad. Is that why you stayed married as long as you did? Incompatible methods of caring? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of my hand. Among other things. What were the other things? Fear, stubbornness, the belief that if I just tried harder, I could become the person she needed me to be. He looked up, met my eyes. And the fact that I wasn't entirely sure who I was if I wasn't trying to be someone else. And now you know? Now I know it's okay not to be entirely sure. His smile was self-deprecating but warm. Turns out you don't have to have everything figured out to be worth knowing. You just have to be willing to be honest about what you don't know. The honesty in his voice was disarming. In Chicago, I was surrounded by people who spoke in certainties, who projected confidence even when they were improvising. But here was Caleb, admitting to uncertainty like it was a virtue instead of a weakness. I don't know who I am if I'm not the son who left and made good, I said, surprising myself with the admission. Maybe that's worth exploring. Maybe. We sat in comfortable quiet for a while, drinking tea and listening to the rain. The storm had mostly passed, leaving behind a steady, soothing sound of water on roof and windows. The house felt peaceful now, like it had weathered something difficult and emerged intact. I should try to get some sleep, I said eventually, though I wasn't sure sleep was possible. You should. Caleb didn't move to leave, just sat with his hands wrapped around his mug. I'll probably stay up a while longer. I'm not much of a sleeper when there's weather. You can take my father's room if you want. The bed's more comfortable than the couch. The couch is fine. I've slept in worse places. I wanted to argue, to insist he take the bed, but something in his tone suggested the conversation was closed. Instead, I found myself reluctant to leave the kitchen to break the spell of intimacy we'd created with honest conversation and shared quiet. Caleb? Yeah, thank you for staying, for helping, for... I struggled to find words for what he'd given me, for not trying to fix everything. You're welcome. I stood, rinsed my mug in the sink, started toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. At the doorway, I paused. If you need anything, I'll be fine. Try to get some rest. Sleep, as I'd predicted, was elusive. I lay in my childhood bed, the same twin mattress I'd slept on from age 8 until I left for college, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me. Every creak and groan was familiar, like a language I'd forgotten I knew. The letters sat on the nightstand beside me, a stack of unread communication that felt both precious and dangerous. Part of me wanted to read them all immediately, to absorb everything my father had wanted to say, but never had the courage to send. Another part of me was terrified of what I might find, not just love, but disappointment, questions about choices I'd made, expectations I'd failed to meet. After an hour of tossing and turning, I gave up. I pulled on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt and made my way back to the kitchen, drawn by the faint light I could see from the hallway. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, now dressed in a pair of sweatpants and a flannel shirt that looked like they belonged to my father. He had a fresh cup of tea steaming in front of him and was reading a paperback western with a cover featuring a lone cowboy silhouetted against a sunset. Couldn't sleep either? He asked without looking up. Too much in my head. I know the feeling. He closed the book, marked his place with a torn piece of paper. Tea? Sure. He got up to make me a cup, moving quietly to avoid disturbing the peace of the late-night house. Outside, the rain had settled into a gentle, steady rhythm. The storm's drama had passed, leaving behind something softer and more sustainable. Is that my father's shirt? I asked as he handed me the tea. I keep some clothes here. He sat back down, saw my expression. I helped him with a lot of projects that got messy. It was easier than going home to change every time. Kept on present tense, like the arrangement was still active. Like he hadn't fully processed that There would be no more projects, no more reasons to have spare clothes in my father's house. You can keep doing that if you want, keeping clothes here. The offer surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise him. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen with the house, but for now, that's generous of you. It's practical, and besides, they look better on you than they ever did on him. Caleb smiled at that, the first genuinely amused expression I'd seen from him. Frank was about 20 pounds heavier and 3 inches shorter than me. Everything was too big around and too short in the sleeves. But you wore them anyway. I wore them anyway. We settled into comfortable quiet again, sipping tea and existing in the same space without feeling the need to fill every moment with conversation. It was a skill I'd forgotten I had, being present with another person without performing, without managing impressions or steering toward outcomes. Can I ask you something personal? Caleb said after a while. Seems like we're past the point of polite boundaries. When you were growing up, did you always know you were gay? The question caught me off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was so direct. In Chicago, people approached sexuality sideways with careful language and diplomatic phrasing. But Caleb asked like he was inquiring about my favorite color. Not always, but early. I thought about it, tried to remember when awareness had become understanding. Maybe 12 or 13. There were signs before that, but that's when I put the pieces together. Was it hard? In a place like this, hard enough. I didn't elaborate on the specific memories, the careful hiding, the fear of discovery, the way I'd learned to camouflage any behavior that might raise questions. One of the reasons I was so eager to leave. What about you? Later, college mostly. Caleb's fingers traced the rim of his mug. I convinced myself it was just curiosity, experimentation. Then I convinced myself it didn't matter because I was going to marry Sarah anyway. Your ex-wife. My ex-wife. His voice was matter of fact, but I could hear older pain underneath. I thought I could make it work through sheer determination, be the husband she deserved, build the life we'd planned. It took me way too long to realize that wanting something to be true doesn't make it true. How long were you married? 8 years, 3 of them good, 2 of them okay, 3 of them miserable for both of us. He looked up, met my eyes. She knew by the end, maybe not consciously, but she knew something was fundamentally wrong. I was trying so hard to be straight that I had drawn